From Photonics Media, this is All Things Photonics, a podcast where we explore industry-shaping advancements in lasers, optics, imaging, metrology, and sensing. Each episode, we'll speak with some of the brightest minds in industry and research about the trends shaping the landscape of photonics.
Today's episode is brought to you by Hamamatsu Corporation, a leading manufacturer of devices for the generation and measurement of infrared, visible, UV light, and X-rays. Hamamatsu is dedicated to the advancement of photonics through extensive research and offers specialized systems for select applications. Visit hamamatsu.com to learn more.
2 decades and 1 year after physicists at the University of Manchester deployed the so-called Scotch tape method to isolate graphene, the popularity of this 2D material is surging once again in physics circles. The distinctive properties that earned graphene billing as a wonder material have not dissipated. R&D efforts aiming to apply graphene's supreme strength, high flexibility, and excellent conductivity are numerous. Research initiatives and consortia targeting science and biomedical outcomes now comprise companies from diverse sectors and high technologies. But it is the business sector that serves today as the principal metric by which we should chart graphene's ascent into everyday technology. For evidence, one need not look beyond the highest growth markets. The German firm Black Semiconductor announced its acquisition last month of fellow graphene tech company Applied Nanolayers. The addition is set to enable Black Semiconductor to open its Fab 1 headquarters, and the company says to build its 300mm wafer pilot line later this year. The company is targeting integrated graphene photonic chips. Also last month, Camgraphic, a provider of high-bandwidth optical interconnect technology, raised roughly $27 million to support its continued development of graphene photonics transceivers. The company is targeting AI and cellular data transmission applications. These firms are pioneering real-world applications of a material that has long been defined by promise. These undertakings, and others making waves, point to the need for the emergence of a graphene ecosystem, or a supply chain, or perhaps a foundry. It is in this context that Paragraf, that's Paragraf, has arrived on the scene. Already, the University of Cambridge spin-out has realized the mass production of graphene-based electronic devices. Using standard semiconductor processes, the company has graphene Hall sensors and graphene field effect transistors in production. Now, Paragraf is turning to photonics and optoelectronics, and in line with this ambition, the device developer is offering custom 2D foundry services, a vital step in the ramp-up of graphene photonics and technologies more broadly. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Andy MacInnes, CDO at Paragraf. As the company continues to pursue graphene-enabled applications, its entrance into the photonics market comes as graphene tech embarks on its latest chapter of commercial significance. And I want to begin by asking, frame this through a photonics lens in a photonics context. Historically, what has been the major selling point for graphene?
So let's maybe take a step back here and just again introduce graphene to everyone. I think the term graphene is well known, but exactly what graphene is and what it can and can't do, and maybe not. Graphene is a single atomic layer of carbon. I think even the display behind me, you see these honeycomb hexagons. That's the crystal structure. It's carbon, a single layer of carbon bonded in these hexagons, very strongly bonded within plane, but very loosely bonded pi orbitals, which means carriers perpendicular to that plane of hexagons are very loosely bound and are free to move. And that means high mobility electrons. Again, that honeycomb structure, that's very strongly bonded carbon material. That makes it incredibly strong. So we've got already 2 superlatives. It's an incredibly strong material. It's an incredibly conductive material. It's an atomic layer thick. So it's virtually transparent. It actually has 97% transmission to visible light. In fact, similar transmission from the terahertz range or the mid-IR range to the UV range. So it's a transparent material, inert, very strong, thermally conductive. So it's got all these superlative properties. Now, you mentioned photonics. Photonics for us in Paragraf is a new area, but it is certainly an area that has been widely published, and particularly people the down the road from us here in the Cambridge area, University of Cambridge, they've published widely on photonics. Graphene have published widely on photonics, and they basically seek to exploit the very fact that graphene can absorb, transmit, and emit light in it across a broad spectrum. It has no band gap. It's an extremely broadband absorber. So these inherent properties make this an incredibly interesting material for photonics uses. Its main uses, its main demonstrated use and the maturity of use so far has really been in the electronics arena, but certainly it is being widely explored in photonics for those very reasons, that it can absorb, transmit, and emit light across a very broad spectrum.
I appreciate that answer. In my question, I framed it through a photonics lens. I think I would have been better to frame it through maybe a science lens, talking about the material benefits of graphene. And in that light, harnessing versus detecting, right? Two very different things. You can discern the very advantageous properties, but harnessing them in an actionable way for applications, devices, real life deployments, that's harder. I want to ask you about the evolution of realizing what graphene might do to what graphene is going to do.
Yeah, and that is exactly the question. I mean, that's graphene has been through the hype cycle. It was announced to the world in 2004 when researchers at Manchester University, isolated by the infamous Scotch tape method, immediately the world erupted with what this wonder material could do. But to date, it really hasn't found those practical uses. In a lot of cases, that really boils down to the practicality of how you incorporate graphene into an actual real-life structure. So that comes down to how do you grow it, how do you maintain its properties, and how do you integrate it into a silicon device, a sapphire device, onto a substrate, and then be able to put contacts, withstand photolithography, the standard processing techniques which are required to make a practical, a tangible device. At the advent of graphene discovery, it was originally produced. The Scotch tape method is effectively a mechanical exfoliation. Pulled graphene, progressive layers of graphite away until they were left with one layer of honeycomb material, which is then graphene. Standard methods of making graphene to date have really been variants on that. It's grown by MOCVD methods onto copper, and then transferred by mechanical means off that copper or nickel substrate onto the substrate of choice to integrate it into a device. In doing so, there's question marks surrounding mechanical damage, chemical contamination, and really the scalability and the applicability of that process to the end demonstrated use. And that's really produced a real dichotomy in the literature reports and the practical uses. There are many lab-based reports of what graphene can do, but translating that into manufacturable devices, which the rest of the human race can use,
Yep.
That's been the obstacle. So it's this transition from lab-scale demonstrator to actual real tangible device with a practical use. That's been the obstacle. And really, once you overcome that, you see that maybe some of the more immediate uses in photonics are going to be around silicon photonics. integration of graphene as modulators and detectors. That's probably the primary driver in the photonic sphere right now, to allow this material to finally get a practical use in, let's face it, which is driving down power usage in data processing. That's effectively what silicon photonics is aimed at performing.
I want to sort of prod you on that, the notion that silicon photonics is going to be or support maybe the killer application, if you want to call it that, because I think I don't speak for the full of the photonics space, but I think broadly we're very concerned with devices when we think about electronics, really optoelectronics for our purposes. Silicon photonics and graphene, at what point in the hype cycle, or what point in the evolution of graphene did silicon photonics begin to emerge as the logical or perhaps best fit in terms of moving toward application?
It's really maybe approach this from a different perspective. Graphene is a new exotic material. It's largely unknown. The methods of manufacture, the way you handle it, how you process it, again, largely unknown, being discovered, being refined along the way. They're going through the normal process maturity cycles. So as it stands, graphene is effectively being exploited in existing known device circuitry. So it's got to be a guest on another device. Here's how we make something right now. How do we get graphene to replace something? How do we get it to be involved in this existing infrastructure? So that's why I think that silicon photonics, it is still in its development stages. There are films within silicon photonics which are purported to fill the role that graphene is now being pushed forward into. And so it's quite natural just to try and use that existing infrastructure and demonstrate graphene in that environment. So I think you used the term killer app. Whether that is the final killer app, maybe not, but it is the existing app which is most suitable for graphene integration at this very moment in time.
Is there another material that our listeners can sort of consider as a parallel to what's happening with graphene now?
Yeah, it's there's some obvious parallels to draw with potentially buckyballs. Buckyballs, which is really a generic term for three-dimensional structures of carbon. Smalley, Curl, and Crato received the Nobel Prize for buckyballs in '96. Gaiman and Novoselov received the Nobel Prize in 2010 for graphene. Again, and graphene you could almost think of as sheets of material which can be folded in different ways to create buckyballs or carbon nanotubes or all of these other three-dimensional structures which were earlier discovered. So in some ways, that's maybe a relatable material, because on the introduction of buckyballs, again, there was this amazing hype cycle. It could do everything. It was going to be slow-release medicine, battery films. It immediately spawned a number of potential uses, and it still is being used. And again, maybe it hasn't fulfilled its original potential, and maybe that's also like graphene. Graphene erupted with this amazing potential, which has yet to be fully discovered. However, maybe another Nobel Prize for materials is the GaN, so the gallium nitride LED. That's maybe also a parallel to address in terms of graphene. Gallium nitride, when it first hit the laboratory scene, it was very difficult to grow, You couldn't dope it. It didn't really support light emission. There were a number of problems. It had the potential on paper to do all these things to produce blue light, which was the holy grail at the time. One by one, each of those obstacles was overcome. Again, so in 2014, Akazaki, Amano, and Nakamura and Sora were awarded cumulatively their work onto how the blue light, which eventually became white light LED, was eventually rolled out. And now gallium nitride has gone far beyond the white light LED or the blue LED into electronics, into almost every arena, because it's a wide bandgap semiconductor which can be manipulated into very definite operations. We'd like to think that's the direction for graphene. It's a very difficult material to work with. It's difficult to grow. But one by one, we're overcoming those obstacles, and we're now inserting that graphene into end uses. And maybe at this stage, we should maybe also mention that graphene is generically a two-dimensional material. It's a single sheet of atoms. There are other analogs that exist, which are also 2D materials. Hexagonal boron nitride, and then you'll hear this term transition metal dichalcogenide. So tungsten selenide, moly disulfide. These are analogous materials which, when combined with graphene, can modify its properties to tune wavelength emission or absorption or transmission. It then ventures into, again, analogous to gallium nitride. There is a alloy system where you can tune individual properties of materials with similar materials: gallium nitride, aluminium nitride, aluminium gallium nitride. Here, graphene, HBN, TMDs. You now start having another design freedom within that 2D space to tune optics and tune electronics to preferred outcomes.
Today's episode is brought to you by LightPath Technologies. From concept through prototyping, volume production, and global distribution, LightPath has the optical and infrared imaging knowledge and manufacturing expertise to be your optics and thermal imaging solutions partner every step of the way. Visit lightpath.com to learn more.
You mentioned the 2014 Nobel laureates and their work with blue, and obviously, and I think really principally about Nagamura here, there were strong ties to industry. There still are for that Nobel laureate. And I suppose that brings us to, in the context of graphene, Paragraf. I want to talk about Paragraf, but I suppose before we ask more targeted questions, why don't you explain the company and its ambitions?
Yeah, certainly, great. So Paragraf is effectively a spin-out from Cambridge University. The founders, Simon Thomas and Ivor Guini, were working for Professor Sir Colin Humphrey in Cambridge University, actually on gallium nitride devices. Nice tie-in there. Accidentally, or serendipity, whatever you want to call it, they discovered this method of growing graphene, and it's very pure graphene. It's on a wafer level. So unlike these mechanical exfoliation techniques where graphene is grown on a alternative substrate, copper or nickel or something of that ilk, our core IP is to grow graphene on an electronic or an optoelectronic substrate, and it stays there and it is processed on that wafer. So this is much more conventional to the semiconductor arena. This is no different from, in some sense, from taking a silicon wafer and growing silicon epi on it, and then going off to process CMOS devices. We take a substrate, we grow the graphene on it, we process devices using standard semiconductor practice techniques. We use the same etch tools, lithography, evaporation, singulation, background. These are industry standard techniques using industry standard methods. So what we're trying to address is that practical link of actually being able to harness the properties of graphene or these 2D materials which we've previously mentioned, but in a methodology where it's scalable, repeatable, and the same semiconductor industry practices can be applied to. And that's really our goal in Paragraf. So Paragraf is a company based in the UK. We're just outside Cambridge. I'm currently in the town of Huntingdon, which is probably about 15, 20 miles away from Cambridge. But we're in that sphere of influence of Cambridge. Our goal is not specifically to make graphene devices, although that's the means to the end. Our goal eventually is to become a foundry. We want to be able to utilize our coral growth IP and the IP that we've developed in processing graphene films and basically offer it to the industry. Currently, our main area of focus is electronics. We mentioned earlier that graphene is really considered an exotic material. Because of that, we believe that we have to introduce our own standard products right now to introduce the world to graphene. So we've chosen Hall sensors, which are useful in the electronic vehicle space, as well as molecular sensors based on a technology we call a GFET, a graphene field effect transistor. Again, graphene has some defined advantages in those arenas. We have prototype vehicles in both of those industry sectors. We are actively working with end users right now. And if we were to put maybe a TRL level on this, we'd maybe say for electronics, we're maybe in the 7, TRL 7, maybe 8. We have prototypes out there. End users are using them. The next step is, which we are actively engaged in right now, is having these materials designed into customer platforms. In the photonics space, we are not really entered into that right now. But if I look in the general industry space, I'd maybe say that's maybe about TRL 5 or 6, maybe coming back a bit. It's in that technology demonstration rather than the actual device qualification mode. So it's maybe a little bit back, but it's certainly got the potential to consume those steps and move forward with the steps that we've already undertaken with the electronics arena. And that's basically our intention, to leverage the expertise that we've gained in electronics to now expand our portfolio into photonics.
So TRL readiness levels, or TRL 7 or 8, and call it 7.5, I suppose, in the electronics space, the electronics sector, is impressive, right? And really, no matter what sector, if you're there, then you have somewhat, more than somewhat, arrived at a level where products are functional and integratable. Is that the pitch for Paragraf, or is it more the foundry capabilities? Because those are very distinct things.
Yeah, and that's the products that we're producing are really a means to an end, and it's really the necessity that we have to demonstrate that some of the obstacles of this exotic material have already been overcome. So we feel it's incumbent upon us to show the world that yes, you can make graphene devices. Once the general industry has got a grasp on what graphene can do, and that you can make it in volume and reliable and with quality using standard methodologies, we hope that is then the catalyst for the industry come to us and say, how can we use your process? And that at that point, our process should largely be agnostic to the end product. Whether we make electronics or photonics, obviously there's going to be design elements in there, but the end goal or the end vision is to have a graphene foundry where we can run electronics and optoelectronics and photonics side by side.
We got into this a bit just talking about the material properties and the sort of technology arc of graphene. But at this current point in time, as we talk now, and in light of how you've just unveiled Paragraf, what do you see as the upcoming or maybe the most prominent bottleneck that there is to overcome as it relates to graphene and continuing to push this toward not just devices, but real world applications and end uses?
Yeah, the bottlenecks, I think, are going to be on multiple levels and maybe addressing different aspects of the rollout and growth of graphene. I think, maybe just to reiterate what we mentioned a few moments ago, graphene at the moment is we either make it as a discrete device, in which case it gets integrated at module level with some of the circuitry, or it's a guest layer on an existing device. So there is a limitation to the scope where graphene can be applied right now. So that's maybe one bottleneck. We are hoping that the next bottleneck will be limited by the ability of industry to then understand the properties of graphene and purposely design process flows which will incorporate it as the main element, as the headliner, and maybe put some of the other components around it. Again, this will all depend on those superlative properties of graphene and how and what device and how it would be integrated.
Similar question, but I think it's an important one. Just in terms of gauging progress in the technology space, what are I guess links on the chain or the check marks that you look to as the best evaluation of progress, the best measures of sustaining progress?
I mean, certainly from a company perspective, our revenue and our sales
I set you up for that one yet.
Yeah, and ultimately that is the measurement of our progress and our success. We do have revenue and we do have sales. We'd certainly like larger revenue and larger sales. At this stage, maybe because of the length of some of the design cycles in the environments that we occupy, particularly automotive, electronic vehicles, some of those shorter term metrics are maybe design wins or socket wins, because they then indicate the intention of an end user to incorporate at some date, given successful qualification or given successful further design in larger scale integration. Photonics, I think, would be the same way. It's really going to be prototype demonstrations followed by design wins, socket wins, but ultimately this comes down to revenue. Paragraf is has a goal to be a profitable large scale company. Ultimately, that's what we have to achieve. We are making real world devices to sell to the real world.
You were at Photonics West earlier this year in January into February, and right there alongside about 24,000 of the industry's best and brightest. I want to ask you, what was Paragraf's aim there, the types of dialogue you were having, and how was the show for you?
The show, as you said, 24,000 of photonics directed individuals is a sight to behold. It's a real jamboree, and it's a very intensive week. Paragraf really wanted to use that week to test the waters with the industry. We did target selected individuals and selected companies just to bounce ideas off, to gauge the readiness level for graphene, and to some extent the maturity level, to show them what we've done with electronics so far, and see if that addresses some of the reluctance, or if it can break down any barriers that may exist in the photonics world to the integration of graphene and other 2D materials. So it was really a fact-finding mission. It was very successful. We did make some very good contacts, got some excellent feedback. It is clearly, as indicated in maybe our assessment of TRL, it's maybe a few steps back, but there is certainly a huge amount of interest. And again, the potential of graphene is such a high payoff that you can see what is generating that interest. So it was a very successful week for us. It wasn't, we did not go there to sell materials. It was really to gauge the state of the industry. But we did come back very impressed that there is an industry there, and there is areas that we can address.
Andy MacInnes of Paragraf joining us on the All Things Photonics podcast. Andy, thank you very much. This is interesting to put this in the perspective almost of electronics and then talk about it through a photonics lens. I appreciate the insights, and best of luck moving forward.
Great. Thanks very much, Jake.
With that, we conclude another episode of All Things Photonics. Thank you to our sponsors, to the technical staff behind the scenes, and to continued support from the Photonics Media editorial team. As always, questions, comments, thoughts, and ideas are welcome. Let us know how we're doing via email at allthings@photonics.com. All Things Photonics is available on all major platforms and on our website, photonics.com.